Alright, hello everyone. Good news is that I'm in a new location, so I have a room to myself. The bad news is that I didn't bring my mic, the wind shield, all the audio stuff. So you might hear some reverb and ambience noise in this video. Hopefully it isn't too bad. Anyway, yesterday I saw a message in Grandpa from Cole. Sorry to talk to you like this, Cole, but they mentioned that Nimzo-Indian and Rossolimo are related in that both your plan is often to trade off a bishop for a knight multiply against a bad pawn structure. I don't understand either. So that's a very fair question, right? Because let me just put this away first. So generally, when we are taught opening principles, we learn that we want to control the center, we want to develop our pieces, knights before bishops, and then afterwards when we develop our bishops, we want to generally avoid trading in the opening. So very common example here in the Prix when black plays a6, it is common for us to play something like bishop a4 to keep our bishop and continue on. Of course, it is perfectly fine to instead of retreating our bishop, it's also okay to trade, but we are often told that this isn't as good of an option. As we learn chess, there may be many reasons for that. Some of them may include, for beginners, trading often means wasting a tempo to do something that you don't really want to do, rather than focusing on developing and getting castle. That may be a reason why there is a general principle to not trade your bishop. Another reason is that bishops are generally more powerful than knights because they have a lot more scope, right? You can see you can travel very far away, whereas knights can only control nearby squares and a very limited number of those squares at that. And as we get more and more advanced, we learn that the bishop pair, especially at high levels, is a very, very powerful positional weapon, and that although double pawns are a positional weakness, in certain cases they are completely fine, if not an asset in some situations as well. So with all of these things in mind, it can be hard to understand certain opening ideas, especially when they get more and more complex. So let's take a look at two openings that were mentioned by Cole, where in this bishop trade over here is a central theme to the opening. For example, the first one brought up was the Nimzo-Indian. Was it the first one? Let me just double check that. Yeah, Nimzo-Indian first. So Nimzo-Indian, okay, of course there are compositions, but we can take a look at how it normally goes. So d4, knight f6, c4, e6, knight c3, and bishop b4 defines the Nimzo-Indian defense. And often in many variations, let's take a look at an example. Let's say e3, castles a3. So very similarly, when this pinning bishop is provoked, I guess, rather than preserving the bishop with bishop to a5 keeping the pin, or bishop to e7 to preserve your dark square bishop, the central idea in Nimzo-Indian defense is to trade off this bishop over here, or the knight, resulting in this quote-unquote bad pawn structure. Similarly, in the Rossolimo Attack, for those who aren't aware of what it is an opening in the Sicilian, so e4, c5, Sicilian defense. I have 3 opens Sicilian, knight c6, bishop b5 defines the Rossolimo Attack. So in the Sicilian, there are many pawn moves that are viable, right? Because you are playing a bit more slowly, but the idea is that you are controlling the center from the flanks, right? So anything from like d6, e6, g6 are all very, very common moves. But just to illustrate the idea of a quote-unquote bad pawn structure, I'll play d6, which is of course still fine, still theory. But here you can see it's not an unusual line for white to proactively trade here. Bishop takes c6, b takes c6, and here you can see the so-called bad pawn structure that white is trying to play against. So the argument in these two pawns, in these two openings, you might generally hear that by giving up the very powerful bishop pair, you fight against the pawn structure. But what does that actually mean, right? It's so abstract, so positional. For especially intermediate players who are maybe more tactically attuned, it's easier to see material compensation or very concrete compensation as to which side is better. these types of positional compensation where it is more of an idea, a battle of ideas rather than a concrete who is better or who is worse kind of situation, it can be hard to tell and see properly why these things are such a big deal, right? Why is this pawn structure, is it really such a big deal? Can black just be fine? Well, from the very premise that this is a common opening line, you might be able to tell that it is perfectly fine for both sides. And it is just a type of position that white or black chooses to engage in. But to properly understand these two ideas, right, the Nimzo-Indian position here, the Rossolimo attack over here, I think it's very useful if we look at slightly different openings that are very similar, and we look at lines that that result in the same way but with minor differences, and see how those minor differences affect how those lines play out. So for the Nimzo-Indian Defense, I think a good counterpart would be the Bogo-Indian Defense. So if you've never heard of the name before, Bogo-Indian Defense occurs mainly through d4, so knight f6, c4, e6, and very similar to the Nimzo-Indian Defense, but instead of knight c3, we see knight f3 instead, trying to avoid the Nimzo-Indian, preventing the bishop from pinning the knight. Right? So that's the anti-Nimzo-Indian, and the Bogo-Indian Defense is playing bishop b4 check anyway. So oftentimes in the Bogo-Indian Defense, although white can still transpose the Nimzo-Indian by playing knight c3, most often white would play bishop d2, willing to, you know what, I'm not even going to take your bishop pair, I want to keep my pawn structure. So a5 is one of the examples, like, you know, keeping this tension over here, not wanting to trade unprovoked. White tries to provoke it anyway, and bishop takes, queen takes, d6, knight c3, so white manages to develop the knight without getting it traded off, and keeping the pawn structure. So cool, what does that do, right? Let's just follow the line theory, several more moves and see what happens. So knight bd7, that just wants to develop, e3, castles, bishop d3, e5, castles, e8, queen c2, queen e7, knight d2. Now I hope it's very clear to you that both sides are actually vying for control over the e4 square. And now it makes things a lot more clearer. See, this knight over here is an excellent controller, central controller, the d5 and e4 squares. So keeping this knight over here and developing to knight f3 instead can show white's idea of trying to control over this e4 square. And in fact, if you look with hindsight, all of white's moves, most of white's moves more motivated by this premise of trying to control the e4 square. So bishop to d3, knight d2, queen c2, knight c3, preventing the trade of bishops. All of this is medicated, I guess, on the fact that white wants to maybe e4 or control e4 in order to attack black on the king side. So that is one of the reasons why, when you look back at the Nimzo-Indian Defense, that is why black wants to trade off the bishop for the knight, to try and lessen or make it harder for white to control this e4 square. So black commonly, in many Nimzo lines, may play something like c5, b5, maybe b6, bishop b7 to control this e4 square. So basically that's it, right? At some level, it is to increase control over the e4 square. Let's take a look at that Rossolimo attack. So a Rossolimo attack, by name itself, it seems like it wants to attack the very aggressive Sicilian defense. So we can look at a very similar attack in the Rossolimo defense, such as the Grand Prix attack. So in the Grand Prix attacks, there are some lines which are very similar to Rossolimo. So it goes with e4, c5, knight c3, the closed Sicilian rather than the open Sicilian. We'll see what this difference results in. Knight c6, so this is very similar to the Rossolimo, and now bishop b5. Okay, Now to be fair, the Grand Prix is identified by this f4 push over here in the closed Sicilian, but for the sake of choosing a line that's more similar to Rossolimo, we shall look at bishop to b5 immediately. So with inspiration from our Nimzo-Indian Defense we looked at earlier, we can tell that White is trying to play more principally by taking control of the center by pushing the central pawn, right? And developing knights before bishops. So you can see over here, the combination of the central pawn and the knight makes very nice control over the d5 square. On the other hand, Black wants to attack and control the center from the flanks instead. So you can see this from the first two moves, c5, attacking and controlling the d4 square this way, and knight c6, which is also controlling the d4 and e5 squares. And to counteract this idea, White then decides to play bishop to b5 and sort of try and remove this knight to make controlling the d4 square easier. So I guess at some level you can say that, right, it's quite similar with before, right? White just wants to trade this off, remove this knight, and try and play for b4. Well, it's not as simple as that. I'm not to say that the Nimzo-Indian is simple. The Nimzo-Indian has many rich ideas. It was just a way to understand the impact of generally why we might want to trade off bishops for knights so early into the opening. But in the Rossolimo Attack, there are some more advanced ideas that we can see happen more obviously. So what I mean by that is, okay, in the Rossolimo Attack, I mentioned earlier that d6, e6, g6, oops, it's not g6, g6 are all very common pawn moves, right? However, in the Grand Prix attack, or specifically when the knights develop to c3 rather than f3, d6 in this position would be a positional mistake. This is because after bishop takes c6, b takes c6, you can see this is very similar to the Rossolimo. White has access to a move that it didn't have in the Rossolimo attack, which is f4. f4, a very nice move. Previously it wasn't possible because the knight was on c3, right? So in the Rossolimo with the other knight, f4 can't be played because the knight is blocking it. So d6 is completely fine. But with f4, over here, White has a way to punish this sort of pawn structure very well. This is because you might hear that if you have studied the system before, White would be very happy if White manages to play d4, because then White will manage to control the center, right? And Black will be very happy if Black manages to play d5, because in the first move itself, c5, Black gives up putting a pawn in the center, so being able to regain control and play d5 safely oftentimes means that Black has managed to get a positional win. So by playing f4, White is actually able to make sure that Black is unable to progress easily on the king side, and it is it is difficult to properly execute the thematic idea of playing e6 in order to play d5. We shall see why, right? Let's take a look at an example. Let's say Black can't really play e6 now, because then White will be able to very quickly bust open the center, and with more development and easier development on the king side, White will be able to mount a very dangerous attack. So let's say Black just goes g6 instead. So tries to consolidate and get the pieces out as soon as possible, get the king castle, and then this f4, f5, e5 idea wouldn't be such a big deal. Well, White can then progress by, let's say, d3, building a knight square pawn chain, taking advantage of the fact that the knight square bishop is gone, and there is no real need to worry about knights hopping into the center or getting quick development anytime soon. This knight doesn't really have a nice way of developing either because of threats of e5 and things like that. So maybe bishop g7, for example, f3. If Black tries to play e6, White can very quickly bust open the king side, right? So Black doesn't have time to develop. Black can't really play knight f6 because of e5, and Black can't develop to e7 because the pawn was in the way, so the king can't really get castle. Well, due to white's advantage in development, white can very quickly open up the center or the king side and mount an attack. So for example, castles, knight e7 and e5 over here. And this pawn chain, this pawn center from black will be crippled very easily. And even if black tries to just give up the pawns and just run away, like let's say castles, white has still very strong attacking chances on the king side. So this is almost, I think, winning for white even. And we can see that if black earlier on, if black tries to instead prevent white from building a light square pawn chain with a move like c4, so preventing d3 and getting the bishop, queen, knight, king out, preventing white from developing so harmoniously, white can even go so far as to undermine this by playing d3. Right? And black is still behind in development, still has less space, less control, white still has a very mobile pawn mass, and white's just better overall. So you can see how why this is called the Prix attack and why the Rossolimo is also an attack. Okay? Because by trading off this bishop for knight, you can turn that into an advantage in development and create a pawn structure and exploit it using a mobile pawn mass on the king side, so not an attack, either in the center or on the flanks. So that's pretty much the answer to the question. If you want to find a link to this study, you can do so in the description. But wait, you might say, that's fine and all, but how did you decide to choose the Bogo-Indian and Grand Prix attack? Right, these are not very popular openings, at least comparative to mainline Sicilians and Nimzo-Indians, right? And to be fair, I am a player of these two openings, so the Bogo-Indian Defense and Grand Prix Attack. I do play those openings, so that was why I was able to recognize those patterns very quickly. I'm not going to tell you to just study more openings or to look up videos of the opening that you're trying to understand or look up resources or read books, although that would help, right? But there is also a way to come to these conclusions yourself, just as I have. Let's say generally, in complex openings, it may not be so easy for you to draw parallels between different openings or in different positions. How do you understand these difficult ideas? So actually, all you have to do is you can also do the same thing, which is look at slightly different openings to understand the ideas, but break it apart, simplify the process, and approach it in a step-by-step manner. So what I mean by that is, let's take a look back at the Nimzo-Indian Defense, right? So the first step is to, whenever you reach a position, this is Nimzo-Indian, it's not Nimzo-Indian, wait, chess, okay. So if you reach a position where there's an idea that you don't understand, let's say this bishop takes move, right? You don't understand it, well, that's okay. You can look before or after. So let's take a look before first, right? You trace your steps. Remind yourself on why this development, why this opening is so principled and so natural. To d4, let's go back to basics. Putting a pawn in the center, controlling the e5 and c5 squares with the pawn. Knight to f6 is also a controlling move, trying to control the corresponding squares, e4 and d5, right? Because if you try and contest the same squares as white, you are one step slower. So most of the time, it might not be the idea that you want to go for. So oftentimes, black will try to control the corresponding squares instead. And controlling it so the piece is more flexible, because you get to choose which opening or which line you want to go. So c4, trying to maintain even more control over the center by developing the pawn before the knight. e6, anticipating this knight move and preparing to develop the bishop and get your king castle quickly. c3, bishop b4, so this is all in line with white's plan, right? And also black's plan as well, taking the pieces out quickly and getting castle. So e3, getting your bishop out. White doesn't have enough control to play e4, so e3 is played instead. Castles, completing your idea. A3, trying to get rid of this pin as soon as possible. Knight takes c3, bishop takes c3, b takes c3. So we can tell that this bishop move is actually part of the plan to control the center in the opening from black and white. So that's one way to look at it. We can also look at after, right? So what happens afterwards? How does the game normally progress? Let's say c5. So if the c5 move, you want to maybe chip at the center. You don't really want to take, because then you will allow white to undouble their pawns. At the same time, you'll be very happy if white decides to take. Because look at these triple pawns, they're so ugly, right? Queen c7, scoop them up. And if pushing, you are fine with that as well. You can still do things as normal. So c5, maybe you want to develop your knight afterwards. There are many other moves as well. Maybe b6, maybe controlling the e4 square this way instead. Maybe d5, trying to put a stake in the center with a pawn. Not afraid of trading, because then white will get a backwards pawn or something like that. So there are many ideas and many examples that you can see by looking at what naturally progresses afterwards as well. You might be able to tell that, oh, I'm able to trade the bishop for a knight because of these resources that I will have afterwards. And that's how I can progress my plan. Another way is to look at different lines. So for example, if I didn't trade and I retreated, what are the common moves? Right? Maybe check an opening book or open the engine. Or maybe this would allow give white too much control over the center, and white may be able to play a very quick d5, something like e takes d5, c takes d5, and this might be very scary for black, which has very little space to work around it. So this might be unfavorable, and that's why rather than allow white this much control over the center, trading might be preferable. And going one step further, rather than different lines, look at the different opening. If retreating in this position is bad, what about if I look at an opening where retreating is good? Or if I look at a different opening where maybe white doesn't allow this knight c3 to be played. So for example, in the Bogo-Indian Defense, where rather than allowing this knight c3, we go knight f3 instead. What happens if there isn't a knight over here and we play bishop b4 and trade it off? Right? So what does white stand to earn from keeping this knight over here? And by learning the value of having this knight over here, we learn the value of taking it away from white and progressing our own plan. Alternatively, in our Grand Prix example, we see what happens if we are the ones who do a minor difference, right? Like if we develop to knight c3 instead of knight f3, what happens if black tries to do the same thing? If black tries to do the same thing, we are able to punish it so. And there we are able to see how a similar idea, when it is amplified, where we are able to objectively be in a better position from a similar idea, we'll be able to see the strength of this idea in a more objectively equal position. So in the Rossolimo Attack, you can see what's the ideal situation that white will be able to have. So if black plays this position wrongly, if black isn't able to make use of this pawn structure well enough, then we can see that white will be able to have a very simple and harmonious development and be able to put pawns on light squares, attack on the dark squares, and mount a dangerous attack on black's center or flank. Right? So we're able to come to these conclusions by looking at these various methods. So that is a quick guide, I guess, on how to understand complex ideas in the opening. Thanks for watching, and I will be playing a classical game against, I think, Kana either this week or next week. So look forward to that.